New York, the city that never sleeps, is a symphony of bright neon lights, towering skyscrapers, and unrelenting energy. At the heart of this vibrant metropolis lies Trump Grill, a beacon of sophistication and opulence. Known as one of the city's most prestigious dining establishments, it's a place where power meets elegance, where business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities gather to discuss deals and enjoy culinary masterpieces. Each evening at Trump Grill feels like stepping into a carefully orchestrated play. The scene outside is as grand as the interior, with Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and black-tinted SUVs pulling up one by one. The doors swing open to reveal finely dressed patrons, men in tailored suits worth thousands of dollars, and women in designer evening gowns, glittering with diamonds and jewels. Each arrival is like a statement, a declaration of status in this exclusive world. Inside, the atmosphere is equally enchanting. Warm light from crystal chandeliers casts a golden glow over every table, illuminating the deep red hues of wine swirling in delicate stemware and the polished silver cutlery arranged meticulously on pristine white tablecloths. The soft melody of a grand piano, played live by a skilled musician, weaves through the low murmur of conversations. Laughter, gentle and refined, punctuates the air. Every detail speaks of affluence, from the fresh floral arrangements gracing each table to the servers moving with practiced precision, dressed impeccably in black and white. As the evening unfolded with its usual blend of understated glamour, the large glass doors of Trump Grill opened unexpectedly, and a tall figure entered. For a moment, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant seemed to pause as he stepped inside. Unlike the other patrons, this man did not exude wealth through his attire. He was dressed in a simple navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, with no tie to complete the look. His loafers, though clean, bore the unmistakable signs of wear, the kind of scuffs and creases that come from years of regular use rather than from a deliberate choice of distressed designer footwear. His signature blonde hair, neatly combed, caught the soft glow of the chandeliers, adding a touch of familiarity to his presence. Yet, his understated ensemble made him an odd figure amidst the sea of polished perfection. Patrons at nearby tables stole glances. Their curiosity piqued. Who was this man? The answer wasn't immediately obvious to everyone. He carried himself with a calm but commanding presence, the kind that seemed at odds with his modest appearance. While some dismissed him as a businessman seeking a quiet dinner, others stared a moment longer, sensing there might be more to him than met the eye. At the reception desk, Rebecca, a young server with sharp eyes and an air of confidence, took notice of him right away. Rebecca had worked at Trump Grill for several years, and she prided herself on her ability to gauge the status of patrons with a single glance. Her training and experience had honed her professionalism, but her judgmental tendencies often led her to quietly sort guests into mental categories based on their clothes, demeanor, and the car they arrived in. When her eyes landed on the man approaching her, she felt an instant sense of unease. Something about his appearance didn't align with the usual clientele she catered to. He didn't have the polished look of a CEO or the effortlessly chic style of a celebrity. No, this man seemed out of place, straightening her posture and fixing a polite smile on her face. Rebecca prepared to greet him, but behind her professional demeanor, her mind was already at work, forming conclusions. A blazer without a tie? Worn shoes? Definitely not the kind of guest who frequents a place like this. As the man approached, Rebecca's smile widened slightly, her voice tinged with practiced friendliness. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone measured but cool. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" The man returned her smile, his expression calm and unbothered. "Not tonight," he said in a deep, steady voice. "But I was hoping you might still have a table available." Rebecca raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, her eyes scanning him once more. The way he spoke suggested confidence, but his appearance told another story. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, her tone growing slightly more pointed. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said, emphasizing the word fine. "Are you sure this is the kind of place you're looking for?" Her words hung in the air, and a few diners at nearby tables glanced up, sensing the subtle tension. The man's smile didn't waver. If anything, his expression grew even calmer. "I'd like to experience this place," he replied simply, his tone unwavering, as if her question hadn't carried any hidden meaning. Rebecca's lips curved into a tight smile, though her eyes betrayed her skepticism. "Very well," she said briskly. "Follow me, please." She turned sharply on her heel and began leading him through the restaurant. As they passed the central dining area, where the most coveted tables were situated under the grand chandeliers, Rebecca didn't pause. Instead, she continued walking, taking him past tables filled with laughing, well-dressed patrons, to a quieter, less glamorous corner near the kitchen. The faint clang of pots and pans could be heard from the swinging doors, and the hum of the air conditioning was more pronounced here. It was a spot reserved for walk-ins or patrons who didn't quite meet the restaurant's usual standards. Rebecca pulled out a chair with a faint scrape against the tiled floor and gestured toward it. "This should work for you," she said, her tone polite but with an edge of condescension. The man took his seat without complaint, still wearing his faint smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice even and pleasant. Rebecca placed a menu on the table with a soft thud, loud enough to catch the attention of a few nearby diners. "Just so you know," she said, her voice slightly louder than necessary, "our Wagyu filet is priced at $450. If you'd like, I can recommend something more affordable." Nearby, a couple at the next table exchanged a glance, their eyebrows raised in silent disapproval. A woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "She's being so rude. Doesn't she realize who he might be?" The man looked up at Rebecca, his gaze steady and calm, his expression unchanged. "I'll have the filet, medium rare," he said simply, "and a glass of your finest red wine." "Thank you." For a moment, Rebecca hesitated, caught off guard by his composed response, but she quickly recovered, plastering a tight smile on her face. "Of course," she said, turning away with a slight smirk. As she walked back toward the reception desk, her thoughts raced. Let's see how he reacts when he gets the bill. As the tall man stepped into the lavish dining hall of Trump Grill, the elegant hum of conversations and the soft melody of the piano seemed to falter for a moment. Heads turned subtly, curiosity flickering in the eyes of nearby diners as they took in the unusual sight. This wasn't the type of patron they were accustomed to seeing here. At one table near the entrance, a woman leaned closer to her companion and whispered, "Doesn't he look familiar? Could that be Donald Trump?" The man across from her gave a skeptical glance in the stranger's direction and shook his head. "No way. Trump wouldn't walk in dressed like that. He's always in a sharp suit, perfectly tailored. That guy's just too casual." Their eyes lingered on the man for another moment, but as he moved further into the room, they shrugged and returned to their conversation, dismissing him as an unremarkable guest. However, at the reception desk, Rebecca, a young waitress with sharp features and an air of polished professionalism, had been watching him intently from the moment he stepped through the door. Rebecca prided herself on being able to size up customers with a single glance, a skill she'd honed over years of working in one of New York's most exclusive dining establishments. To her, appearances mattered. Every guest who entered the grand doors of Trump Grill was automatically subjected to her unspoken evaluation. From the cut of their suit to the sparkle of their jewelry, Rebecca had learned to gauge wealth, status, and significance in an instant. And this man? He didn't check any of the usual boxes. His blazer, while clean, lacked the crispness of high-end tailoring. His white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, gave no hint of designer labels, and his loafers, though polished, bore unmistakable signs of wear, creases in the leather and scuffs along the soles that suggested years of use. In a restaurant where most guests arrived in perfectly coordinated ensembles that screamed luxury, this man's attire stood out. To Rebecca, it wasn't just a lack of elegance, it was a lack of belonging. As the man approached the reception desk, Rebecca straightened her posture, her polished smile sliding smoothly into place. She was the picture of professionalism on the surface, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of judgment as they scanned him once more. "Good evening," she greeted, her tone polite but clipped, carefully modulated to exude control. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" The man's faint smile didn't waver. If he noticed her scrutinizing gaze, he gave no indication. His voice, warm and steady, carried just enough authority to command attention without sounding boastful. "No," he replied, "but I was hoping you might still have a table available." Rebecca raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued despite herself. It wasn't every day someone walked into Trump Grill without a reservation and asked for a table with such confidence, especially someone who looked so out of place. "I see," she said, her words slow and deliberate, giving her time to decide how to handle this situation. She had been trained to handle difficult guests, to politely redirect or deflect when necessary. But this man wasn't difficult. He was polite, calm, and oddly self-assured, which only added to her confusion. After a brief pause, she let her smile sharpen slightly, adding a subtle edge to her tone. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said, drawing out the words just enough to emphasize their significance. "Are you sure this is the kind of place you want to dine?" The question was meant to disarm him, to make him second-guess his choice and perhaps leave of his own accord. Rebecca had seen it work before, and part of her expected the same result now. But the man didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly, his bright eyes steady and unyielding. His smile remained faint but unwavering, as though her subtle jab had slid off him like water off a stone. "I'd like to experience this place," he said simply, his voice calm and even, as if her question hadn't carried any hidden meaning. For a moment, Rebecca hesitated, caught off guard by his composed response. Most people, faced with such an unspoken challenge, would have faltered, if not outwardly, then at least in their tone. But this man's demeanor remained effortlessly steady. "Well," she said finally, recovering her composure, "let me see what I can do." Turning on her heel, she gestured for him to follow. As she led him through the grand dining area, her mind raced with silent assessments. Who was he? And what made him think he belonged in a place like this? Rebecca led the man through the grand dining area, her polished black heels clicking softly against the gleaming marble floor. As they passed the central tables, her pace quickened just enough to discourage him from lingering or taking in the luxurious surroundings. The central dining area was the heart of Trump Grill, tables draped in crisp, white linen, adorned with glowing candles and fresh floral arrangements. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, well-dressed patrons laughed softly, savoring their meals and sipping wine that cost as much as a small car payment. Rebecca made no effort to slow down or acknowledge the empty tables scattered among the prime seating area. Instead, she walked purposefully toward the back of the restaurant, where the ambience was decidedly less refined. The lighting here was dimmer, the air faintly tinged with the aroma of cooking oil and sizzling meat wafting from the nearby kitchen. The faint clatter of dishes and muffled voices of kitchen staff could be heard through the swinging doors just a few feet away. She stopped abruptly at a small table near the wall, its position leaving little doubt that this was the least desirable spot in the restaurant. Rebecca pulled out a chair and gestured for him to sit, her smile tight and carefully measured. "This spot should suit you just fine," she said, her tone dripping with a thinly veiled sarcasm. The deliberate thud of the menu as she placed it on the table was loud enough to catch the attention of nearby diners, some of whom glanced over, curious about the interaction. The man, however, didn't seem the least bit fazed. He sat down calmly, his movements unhurried, and looked up at her with a faint smile that remained unchanged. "Thank you," he said, his tone warm and genuine, as though he hadn't noticed her attempt at subtle humiliation. Rebecca straightened, folding her arms briefly and casting a sidelong glance at him. Something about his calm demeanor annoyed her. She had seen this type before, or so she thought. People who wandered into places like Trump Grill trying to rub elbows with the elite, but who clearly didn't belong, not content to leave the moment as it was. She lingered near his table, deliberately raising her voice loud enough for others to hear. "Just so you know," she began, her tone overly sweet, "our Wagyu filet is priced at $450. If you'd like, I could suggest something a bit more affordable." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the low hum of conversation around them. Nearby diners began to glance over, their curiosity shifting to disapproval. At one table, a woman leaned toward her companion, her voice barely a whisper. "She's being so rude. Doesn't she realize who he is?" Her companion shook his head, frowning. "Even if she doesn't, you don't treat anyone like that. It's unprofessional." Meanwhile, Rebecca stood her ground, waiting for the man to react. Perhaps she expected him to look embarrassed or flustered, to hesitate or ask about a cheaper option. But instead, he simply looked up at her, his expression calm and composed, the faint smile never leaving his face. "I'll have the filet," he said, his voice steady, "medium rare, please, and a glass of your finest red wine." "Thank you." For a brief moment, Rebecca hesitated, caught off guard by his unwavering tone and confidence. She had anticipated discomfort, maybe even a sheepish excuse, but his response was so self-assured that it left her momentarily at a loss. Quickly recovering, she forced a smile and nodded curtly. "Very well," she said, her voice sharper now, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Turning on her heel, she walked away, her steps brisk and purposeful. As she headed toward the kitchen to place his order, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Inwardly, she thought, "Let's see how he reacts when the bill arrives." Behind her, the man adjusted his chair slightly, his movements unhurried. He glanced briefly around the room, taking in the sideways glances and quiet murmurs from nearby tables, but his expression remained untroubled, as if the awkwardness of the moment had no power to disturb his peace. At another table, a middle-aged couple observed the scene with quiet interest. The woman leaned toward her husband, her brow furrowed in disapproval. "Did you hear what she said to him? That was completely out of line." The man nodded, setting down his wine glass. "I don't know who he is," he murmured, "but he handled that better than most people would." Rebecca, now standing by the service counter, glanced back toward the man's table, her thoughts still swirling. Who does he think he is? Coming in here dressed like that and acting like he owns the place? She didn't know it yet, but the answer to her question would soon change the course of her evening, and perhaps much more. As the man quietly enjoyed his meal, the clink of silverware and hushed conversations that filled the room began to take on a different tone. It started as a faint ripple, one table exchanging curious glances. A whisper passed from one diner to another. Then it grew louder, spreading like wildfire across the elegant dining room. "That's Donald Trump," someone murmured, their voice barely audible, but carrying enough weight to make others at the table lean in closer. "The Donald Trump? Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. Look at him. And he owns this entire building." At first, only a handful of people noticed, but as the realization dawned on more and more diners, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Heads turned subtly toward the corner table where the man Saturday composed and unbothered, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Rebecca, meanwhile, was busy at another table, her sharp smile and polite efficiency masking her complete oblivion to the growing buzz around her. She moved with confidence, completely unaware that the man she had just dismissed as an out-of-place guest was now the center of attention. It wasn't until the kitchen doors swung open with a sharp whoosh that the tension in the room seemed to solidify. Mr. Harrison, the restaurant's manager, emerged with quick, purposeful strides. A man known for his calm demeanor, Harrison now wore an expression of thinly veiled concern. His usually relaxed gait was replaced with a brisk urgency as he navigated the rows of elegant tables. Every step he took drew the eyes of curious diners, and as they realized where he was heading, the whispers subsided into a heavy silence. All eyes followed him as he approached the man in the corner. When Harrison reached the table, he immediately straightened his posture and offered a respectful bow. His voice, usually steady and reserved, now carried an unmistakable tone of reverence. "Mr. Trump," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "It's such an honor to have you here this evening. I sincerely apologize if there's been any inconvenience during your visit." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The gentle hum of the restaurant came to an abrupt halt, leaving only the faint sound of a wine glass being set down at a nearby table. Rebecca, standing just a few feet away, froze in mid-step, the tray she was carrying suddenly feeling heavier in her hands. Her polished exterior cracked as her eyes widened in disbelief. The words, "Mr. Trump," rang in her ears, louder than the whispers that had surrounded her all night. "Mr. Trump?" she thought, her heart pounding. "He's Donald Trump?" The realization hit her like a freight train, each mocking comment she had made earlier replaying vividly in her mind. "Are you sure you want to dine here?" she had asked him, her tone dripping with condescension. And then, "Our Wagyu filet is $450. Would you like something more affordable?" The weight of her words now felt unbearable. Her face flushed as a rush of shame coursed through her. She couldn't bring herself to move, let alone meet the eyes of anyone nearby. At the surrounding tables, diners exchanged wide-eyed glances, some whispering quietly behind their hands. Others simply stared, their gazes flicking between Trump and Rebecca, who now looked as though she wished the floor would open up beneath her. Trump, however, remained as composed as ever. He set down his glass of wine with a quiet clink and looked up at Harrison with a faint smile. "No inconvenience at all," he said, his voice steady and unbothered, as if he hadn't just turned the entire restaurant's attention toward him. But even as Trump's calm response eased some of the tension in the air, the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The unassuming man who had walked in so quietly had revealed himself to be not just a guest, but the owner of the very establishment where he sat. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The air around her felt thick and heavy, each second dragging on as she stood rooted to the spot. She wanted desperately to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, to escape the judgmental stares of the patrons who had undoubtedly witnessed her earlier behavior. But she couldn't move. At one table, a middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband, her voice low but filled with incredulity. "Did you see the way she treated him earlier?" The man nodded, his expression one of quiet disapproval. She had no idea who he was. but that doesn't excuse it. You don't treat anyone like that, no matter who they are. Nearby, a young couple exchanged hushed words. The woman, shaking her head, said, "It's not just embarrassing, it's a lesson." She judged him without even giving him a chance. The murmur of voices slowly began to rise again. But now the atmosphere in the restaurant was charged with a new energy. Trump's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Rebecca's frozen figure, and the juxtaposition only served to highlight the weight of the moment. Donald Trump gently set his knife and fork down on the table, the sound barely audible in the now silent restaurant. He leaned back slightly, his composed demeanor radiating an unshakable authority. Turning his gaze to Rebecca, who stood a few feet away, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make an impression. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable weight. "What do you think about how customers should be treated?" The question wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. All eyes in the room turned to Rebecca, whose professional poise had all but crumbled under the weight of her growing embarrassment. Rebecca's hands fidgeted at her sides as she looked down, avoiding his gaze. Her voice, usually steady and controlled, now wavered as she stammered, I didn't know who you were." Trump shook his head slowly, his expression firm but not unkind. "You don't need to know who someone is to show them respect," he said, his words deliberate and direct. "Everyone, no matter how they look, how they're dressed, or what you think of them, deserves to be treated with kindness." His words landed with a clarity that seemed to echo through the room. A few diners exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement. Others simply sat back in their chairs, watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Rebecca's face flushed deep red as the reality of her actions hit her like a wave. She glanced around the room briefly, noticing the disapproving stares from other diners, their judgment clear even in their silence. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and lowered her head further. "I'm sorry, sir," she said finally, her voice trembling but sincere. I promise this won't happen again." Trump studied her for a moment, his sharp blue eyes unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity to Rebecca, his expression softened slightly. "Mistakes," he said, his voice quieter now but no less impactful, "are something we all make. The important thing isn't the mistake itself, it's what you learn from it." Rebecca nodded quickly, her head still bowed. "Yes, sir, I understand. Thank you," she murmured, her words barely above a whisper. At the surrounding tables, the tension began to shift. A middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "He's teaching her something she'll never forget." Her husband nodded. "It's a lesson for all of us." "Honestly," he said quietly, casting a thoughtful glance toward Trump. Across the room, a younger man turned to his dining companion. "You know," he said, his voice low but reflective, "it's rare to see someone handle a situation like this with so much class." He didn't raise his voice or get angry. He just made his point. Back at the table, Rebecca stood frozen, unsure of whether to stay or walk away. Trump, noticing her hesitation, gave her a faint but reassuring smile. "It's not about dwelling on what went wrong," he said, his tone steady. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Rebecca nodded again, this time with a touch more confidence, as though his words had given her permission to move forward. "Thank you," she said again, her voice firmer this time. Trump didn't say anything else, but the slight incline of his head signaled that the moment was over. Rebecca turned and walked away, her steps slow but deliberate. Behind her, the quiet murmurs of the diners began to rise once more, the atmosphere shifting from tense to contemplative. Trump picked up his glass of wine and took a slow sip, his expression as calm and composed as it had been from the start. Around him, the diners continued to glance in his direction, their whispers reflecting a mixture of admiration and introspection. As Donald Trump stepped out of the restaurant, the cool evening air of New York City greeted him. The bustling sounds of the city, the hum of car engines, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honk of a yellow cab created a backdrop that seemed to highlight the stillness of the moment. The streetlights bathed the sidewalk in a soft glow, their light reflecting off the windows of the towering skyscrapers that surrounded him. He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, his tall figure silhouetted against the dazzling lights of Fifth Avenue. Slowly, he turned back to look at the glittering Trump Tower, its golden facade gleaming under the city's endless array of lights. The building stood as a symbol of ambition, success, and power, but in this quiet moment, it seemed to carry a different meaning, one that resonated deeply within him. A faint smile crossed his lips as his thoughts drifted back to what had just unfolded inside the restaurant. The tension, the lesson, the faces of those who had witnessed it all. It lingered in his mind like the final notes of a powerful symphony. This world needs more kindness, he thought, his eyes reflecting the city's vibrant energy. It's so easy to judge, to assume we know someone based on how they look or what we think we understand about them. But true strength, he paused, the words forming clearly in his mind. True strength lies not in judgment, but in understanding. He inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, and allowed himself one last glance at the scene behind him. The warm lights of Trump Grill spilled out onto the sidewalk, casting a welcoming glow, as if the restaurant itself had absorbed the lesson from earlier that evening. The faint echoes of laughter and conversation from inside reminded him that life, in its essence, was about connections, moments where people learned from one another, where understanding replaced assumptions, and where even the smallest actions could leave lasting impressions. Trump's smile grew a fraction wider. He knew the evening's events had been more than just a lesson for Rebecca. It had been a lesson for everyone in the restaurant, a gentle yet profound reminder of the importance of humility, respect, and kindness. Even for him, it served as a moment of reflection, a chance to reaffirm the values he believed in. He adjusted his blazer, the fabric rustling softly in the breeze, and turned away from the tower. The pavement stretched before him, a path illuminated by the city's unrelenting lights. But it wasn't just the street that felt lit. It was the sense of purpose, the reminder that even small moments could carry weight. That gave his steps their characteristic confidence. Behind him, Trump Grill stood as a silent witness to the night's events, its staff and diners likely still processing what had unfolded. Each person who had been present carried their own interpretation of the moment, some reflecting on their own biases, others inspired by the calm dignity with which Trump had handled the situation. With steady strides, Donald Trump walked down the sidewalk, blending into the rhythm of the city he loved. Yet, to those who had seen him that evening, he hadn't just been a figure of power or success. He had been a reminder, a living testament to the idea that true influence wasn't about wealth or titles, but about the way one treated others.